So tonight we're going to basically finish the book of Genesis with part 4 of our Old Testament history. And tonight specifically we're going to talk about the patriarchs. And I've given you the time line there, or the time frame that we're talking about, from about 2166 BC to 1805 BC. And before we talk about the patriarchs in particular, I want us to understand a little more about Old Testament history. First of all, we know that the Old Testament is not mythology. The truth of the Bible rests in its historicity. In other words, we can validate the Bible because we know that it's accurate historically. And God is a God of history. And I kind of like looking at the word history. It's his story. And he reveals himself in human history. And the Old Testament is designed to be a prophetic history. And it's driven by a central theme. And what we see is how God influences human history with a strategic purpose. And so throughout the Bible, the overriding message is that God is working to reconcile humanity to himself. That's God's purpose. That's God's strategy. And this reconciliation, we call it salvation history. And salvation history is God revealing himself to humanity for the purpose of reconciling humanity to himself. And this revelation, if you will, is a progressive revelation. In other words, God didn't drop the whole thing on us at one time. We see through history his dealings with humanity, and we see through history the progress of the revelation of salvation. And so what we see in the Bible is not humanity trying to understand God. Rather, it is God revealing himself to humanity. God is infinite, and there's no way that we as finite human beings could know God if he had not revealed himself to humanity. And so we are very much dependent upon God to speak to us, to tell us, to show us his plan. And that's what he does in the Bible. That's what he does in salvation history. The Old Testament is also a selective history. There's no such thing as a complete history of anything, okay? It would be impossible to include every detail of human history. Even when we look at the history of the United States, we have a selective history. We don't have every detail. In the Old Testament, historical narratives are included for the purpose of understanding God and his revelation of salvation to humanity. So that in and of itself helps us to understand why a passage is in the Bible. So events and people recorded in the Bible, and in particular, in our case, the Old Testament, are selected in relation to the purpose of God's revelation of salvation. And the Bible includes what I would term as a big picture of salvation, especially in the Old Testament. It's the bigger picture. And so then let's look at the patriarchal culture. First of all, patriarchal has to do with family structure. And the word patriarch is a combination of two Greek words. The first one is patri, or patri, P-A-T-R-I, and it means father, and arch means rule. And so patriarch means father, rule. And the patriarch was the head of the family, or the better understanding would be the clan. And so the oldest male in a clan was the head of the family. And so if we take, for example, Abraham, when Abraham was the oldest, he was over everybody, okay? And once he died, then his son would take his place. And so the patriarch was the head of the family. The clan, or the household, consisted of the extended family members, okay? When we talk about Abraham, he had Lot was a part of his extended family, but Abraham was still the patriarch of Lot. The servants in the household and the others who would join with the household. The patriarch's word was the law for the family. And though monogamy was God's plan, polygamy was common in the Old Testament. Of course, monogamy is one man, one wife. Polygamy is one man and many wives. And we see that in the Old Testament. Marriages under the patriarchal culture were commonly arranged marriages. And we see this in the Patriarchs. Genesis mentions many patriarchs, but 4 are specified. That being Abraham, and his record is found in Genesis 12 through chapter 25. Isaac, who comes on the scene in Genesis 21 and goes through chapter 35. Jacob, Genesis 25 through 50, and then Joseph, Genesis 30 through 50. And you'll notice there's overlap, and that's because the history will pick up with one, but yet the other is still living. And so this is why, there's no dead break, if you will, in one chapter to another, one patriarch to another. They overlap throughout Genesis. So then let's start with Abraham. Abraham, his name that we are introduced to at first in Genesis chapter 12 is Abram. And God called Abram. And as you read into chapter 11, God's call of Abram is the starting point for Israel's role in salvation history. Abram's father's name was Terah, and he was a direct descendant from Noah. And Terah had lived in Ur of the Chaldees, and he had left Ur of the Chaldees, and he was on his way to Canaan, but he stopped and he settled in Haran, and that is where he died. Genesis chapter 11, verses 31 and 32 tell us that Terah died in Haran. And here's a map of Abraham's travels. And if you look at the bottom right side, you'll see Ur of the Chaldees. And then the yellow line kind of shows us how Terah traveled with his family. Terah was the patriarch of the family at the time. And they left and they settled in Haran, up here in the very top. And that's where Terah died. And then God spoke to Abram in Haran and told him to get up and go to a land that he would show him. And so then they headed south to Tadmor, and then over to Damascus, and then ultimately into what we call Israel today. Now, I want you to notice also, notice how it's an arc. This yellow line kind of takes a northern arc. Does everybody see where we are? I mean, over here on the far left side of the map, that's the Mediterranean Sea. And then on the right side, we have Babylon. And then all of this barren space down in the south part, that's desert, okay? That's down modern-day Saudi Arabia and all of that, and it's nothing but desert. And all of the travel in those days would take this northerly route so that they didn't go through the desert. I mean, the northerly route, there was food, there was water, there were cities, but no one would dare cut across the desert because there was no food, no water, no cities. And so this was the route that anybody would have taken during those times. So that gives you an idea of Abraham's traveling. So it was in Haran that God called Abram to leave his father's house and to go to a land that God, I will show you. That's in Genesis chapter 12 and verse 1. Additionally, God established his covenant with Abram, which becomes the core of salvation history. And that covenant is as follows. In chapter 12, verse 2, the first part of the verse, that God would make Abram a great nation. In the second part of verse 2, God would bless Abram and make his name great. In the third part of verse 2, God would make Abram a blessing. And then in verse 3, the first part, God would bless those who bless Abram, and he would curse those who curse Abram. And then finally, in verse 3, God would bless all humanity through Abram. And so this is the initial covenant that God makes with Abram. God further promised Abram a son in Genesis chapter 15, verse 4, and offspring that would be as numerous as the stars in the sky. Genesis chapter 15 and verse 5. Then God promised Abram land. However, God also told Abram that his offspring would be enslaved for 400 years before they would receive that land. And that's found in Genesis chapter 15, verses 13 through 16. And of course, that was the foretelling of them being in Egyptian bondage for 400 years. God sealed that promise by cutting a covenant with animal sacrifices. And that's found in Genesis 15, verses 10 through 12. However, the terms of the covenant was faith. And the Bible says in Genesis 15:6 that Abram believed God and it was credited to him or accounted to him as righteousness. And we see this verse establishes the terms of faith that the Apostle Paul would use some 2,000 years later in helping us to understand what Jesus has done and how we receive salvation through him. So it all goes back to Genesis 15 and verse 6. So after several years, Abram and his wife, Sarai, remained childless, and they began to waver in their faith, resulting in Sarai giving Abram her handmaiden, whose name was Hagar. And she told Abram, well, evidently God meant for you to father a child through Hagar because we've been at it and I'm not conceiving. But when Abram was 99 years old, God reaffirmed his promise that he would have an heir and that heir would come through Sarah. And so this was established with the covenant of circumcision, And at that point, God changed Abram's name, which Abram means father, to Abraham, which is the father of many. And this is found in Genesis chapter 17. After several years, let's see, I already did that part. Down toward the bottom, Genesis 21 records the birth of the heir of promise, and his name is Isaac. Then in Genesis 25, verses 7 through 8, Abraham dies at 175 years old. I also need to mention that Sarai's name was changed to Sarah. Genesis 22 contains the record of God's test of Abraham's willingness to sacrifice the promise. And that promise was Isaac. And it's a familiar story. I'm sure everyone knows the story. But it's interesting here, as I was writing that particular sentence, that God tests Abraham's willingness to sacrifice the promise. Okay? Abraham had waited for 25 years for Isaac to be born. And theologians say that Isaac was probably about 12 years old when God told him to sacrifice his son. And it's interesting to think in terms that many times the things that we want so desperately from God, like Abraham wanted a son, that God was asking, are you willing to sacrifice that which you want the most for me? And it's a question that we all need to ask ourselves. Are we willing to sacrifice anything that the Lord asks me to in order to know and serve him? Then we go to Genesis 24, where we are introduced to Rebekah, who would become Isaac's wife, and through whom the two would continue the salvation history. Rebekah and Isaac have twin sons. Esau and Jacob are born. Esau was the firstborn of the twins. And in God's sovereignty, however, God chooses Jacob to carry the line of salvation history. And you know the story of Jacob and how he tricked Isaac into receiving the blessing of the firstborn, and how they separate for many years, and Isaac goes, and we'll get into that just a little bit. But anyway, Isaac dies at 180 years old, and that's recorded in Genesis 35, verses 27 and 28. Then we have Jacob, and he is in Genesis 25 through 50, and the time frame is about 2006 BC for his life. Jacob he connived with his mother Rebekah to obtain Isaac's blessing of the firstborn, leading to his fleeing to escape Esau's anger. Jacob married Leah and Rachel, and along with several servants in time, gave birth to 12 sons, one of whom was Joseph, who was his father's favorite son. Jacob made Joseph a beautiful coat of many colors, Genesis 37:3, and this resulted in his brothers hating him and being jealous of him, Genesis 37:4. Then we see that in time, Jacob dies. He actually dies in Egypt, but he gives birth or gives instruction concerning his burial, and his death is recorded in Genesis 49:33. However, his age is not recorded. And then we move to Joseph. Joseph's life is one of great drama, and he's one of my favorite Bible characters or Bible figures. His father favored him, which caused his brothers to hate him. His death is faked by his brothers, and he's sold into slavery, according to Genesis 37. As a slave in Potiphar's house, Joseph is wrongly accused by Potiphar's wife and is imprisoned, Genesis 39. While he's in prison, Joseph interprets dreams which ultimately lead him to Pharaoh's house, where he is put second in command in Egypt, subject only to Pharaoh. Now, obviously, in 4 or 5 sentences, I've taken several chapters of the book of Genesis. But in Joseph's life, we see how living for God, it doesn't always make sense. Living for God doesn't always make sense. In other words, Joseph's life was dedicated to the Lord, but yet he always found himself in a chaotic situation. You know, he always prospered wherever he was. When he was in Potiphar's house, he prospered. And he was given charge over Potiphar's house. The Bible says that Potiphar's wife tried to lure him, and he fled from her, and she accused him falsely, resulting in him going to prison. And when he's in prison, again, these prisons were really horrible places. And Joseph found favor. He was well liked, and he was put in charge. And so we see that even in hurtful, harmful situations, Joseph rose to the top. And the reason for that is because God was with him. And so we can learn from Joseph's life that even when things don't seem good, that we can still prosper and that we can still do well, because like Joseph, the Lord has promised never to leave us and never to forsake us. So we see that Joseph, due to famine in the land, Jacob's family moves to Egypt under the care of Joseph, where they will spend the next 400 years fulfilling God's word to Abraham. And so the theme of Joseph's life is found in these verses. Genesis 45, verse 7, "But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance." And then Genesis 50, verse 20, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." What you intended for evil, God intends for good. And though I've never read this anywhere, no one's ever said this to me, I believe that Paul's writing in Romans 8:28 stems from the life of Joseph. Paul would have known about the life of Joseph, and the verse fits his life. And what is that verse? We would probably all be able to quote it. "And we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love him, to those who are called according to his purpose." And so we see that verse lived in the life of Joseph. Even when it was bad, when it was hurtful, when it was harmful, when it was negative, God worked it all out for good in and through Joseph's life. And so we can take lessons from each of these patriarchs, and we can see that God's hand was upon them. And again, this teaching is not meant to give us every detail of these men's lives and their families, but to highlight and to show that in their lives, God's plan of salvation is being worked out, and it's being revealed to us. Paul says of the Old Testament that it is a pedagogos. It is a teacher leading us to Christ. And so as we read through these accounts of these individuals, we need to keep in mind and look for salvation history. Notice how God is meticulously working in these individuals' lives to ultimately bring about the birth of his son, Jesus Christ, to redeem humanity. And so that's what I have for tonight. And I wonder if any of you might have any questions. Anybody? Okay. All right. Well, if there are no questions, then I guess we have a short night.
I just had a comment that God planned every step of the way through to salvation.
Yes.
He took everything from creation through all of the Old Testament and everything, and he just took everything through to the cross. And
he did.
I just found that fascinating, how everything was so intricate, and he just planned everything out, and he's still planning it out. But,
yeah. And that gives us hope, knowing, our future, right? Because
right.
we have yet to live out the end of the book.
Right.
But it's going to happen.
Yeah. It just I had heard that before, and maybe from you or someone fairly recently, and just the way you pointed it out there, just how you just carry it through all the way to the cross. It's just really cool.
Right. I had a professor in seminary who said that he used the illustration of a scarlet thread, a red thread that goes from Genesis to Revelation. And there really is a scarlet thread. It's good.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah. Anybody else? Comments, questions, anything?
I have a question.
Yes.
Well, coincidentally, I've been studying, reading Genesis right now, and but on Facebook, this man, it was just a comment. He doesn't know me, and I don't know him, but he made a comment, and I just was snoopy and went to his site, but I wasn't going to talk to him or anything, and he had this article about. At the beginning, he was saying that Israel wasn't in existence when Christ lived here. And yet our Bible, and he was using this old Bible, he showed us the Bible and everything. It wasn't that man that I'm telling you about, but it was an article he had. And it said that Palestine was there, but not Israel. And he said Israel, Lyndon Baines Johnson's was supposedly made Israel the important area, which he said was created later. Anyway, I wanted to know if you knew anything about that, where they said that the Jews killed Palestinians and Christians, and why I know that they, killed some of us Christians because when Jesus first came, they didn't like Jesus and they didn't like Christians. But what I wanted to know is, have you heard anything like that about Israel not even being there yet? It wasn't there till later, and then Lyndon Baines Johnson, many years later, made it a state. The important people of that area. I don't know how to word it. Is there any truth to that we call it Israel, and really the Palestinians were the ones that lived there? And he said Jesus was not a Jew, he was a Palestinian.
Well, I would say that obviously that guy doesn't believe the Bible, and we do, and the Bible tells us that Jesus is a Jew. So, but
Yeah, but
if
he
he's
had an
talking,
old Bible.
well,
I'm
it doesn't
sorry.
matter how old the Bible is. The Word of God says he's a Jew.
That's what I thought. I mean,
Yeah.
I know it, that our word says that.
Yeah.
But I
So if
wondered
he's
if he
talking
knew.
about Israel as a nation, the nation of Israel, then, the nation of Israel ceased in 586 BC. Okay? And we'll talk about that when we get to it in our study.
Oh, okay.
They were taken into Babylonian captivity, and the nation of Israel ceased to exist in 586 BC, and it did not come into existence again until it was 1948. Maybe somebody knows for sure.
1948, because I just read that. Mm-hmm.
All right, so that's when it came back into existence as a nation. So now, during Jesus's time, after 586, 70 years after that, okay, so it'd be like 506 BC, 516 BC, Cyrus of Persia allowed the Jews to go back home. And so they went back to Israel, okay?
Mm-hmm.
But they still were not a nation, okay? They were under the rule of the Persians. Then they were under the rule of the Greeks. Then they were under the rule of the Romans, and so they didn't have their own government. Even Herod the Great, he was kind of a puppet government of the Romans, all right? So if the guy's talking about Israel as a nation didn't exist when Jesus was born, he's right. But if he's saying that Israel, the people, were not there, then I would argue he's wrong. And especially if he's saying Jesus wasn't a Jew, he's wrong.
He said he was a Palestinian.
No, he was a Jew. He was very Jewish. He was very Jewish. Yeah. The Bible's very clear. Yeah. That he's a descendant of Abraham.
I don't think I should say anything to him because I don't even know him. And he's going to stay away. I mean, he's going to stay how he is and how he believes, because I noticed that he was, I don't know what nationality, but he was not American for sure.
Yeah. Well, one thing I've learned is that Facebook and all of that stuff, you can write anything you want to on there. You can say that the moon's made out of cheese if you want to. And you can argue with people if you want to, but I find that life's too short for those kinds of ignorant arguments.
Well, it just bothered me because they hate us so much, the people from Palestine.
I just stay away from them. Stay away from them. Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Anyone else? Anyone else? No one else? All right. Well, God bless you all. Look over that Old Testament timeline that I sent you. It's really interesting. And like I said, keep it handy as you're reading the Old Testament. You can put dates and kind of link things together. So God bless you. Hope to see you tomorrow night at New Life Church.
Thank you.